Defined by the Oxford Dictionary, a self-starter is a person who is sufficiently motivated or ambitious to start a new career or business, or to pursue further education without the help of others. By that definition, I'm not a self-starter because my motivation doesn't exclude me from needing or wanting help, support, or encouragement. Those I connected with, the community, and the institutions have been instrumental in my growth. The more you accept help, the more that can be achieved. So if you change over to another definition from, say, dictionary.com, it's a person who begins work or undertakes a project on his or own initiative without needing to be told or encouraged to do so. And I think that's more accurate. Hello. Disclaimer here. There's something I have to tell you before we can begin. The information provided by Taming Lightning is designed to provide helpful information and to educate on the subjects discussed. That being said, the information provided is true and complete to the best of our knowledge, and is not intended to be used without professional guidance or supervision. All recommendations are made in good faith by both Taming Lightning and affiliates, to which we disclaim any liability in connection with the use of the information we provide. Thus, we ask that you be safe, be informed, and ask questions. Let's get right to it.
GEEX and Taming Lightning are making a 4-part episode series that's functionally a survey or lecture in podcast format. Percy has produced Taming Lightning for 3 years with 30 episodes released. Percy has a full-time job in the hotel industry and uses his spare time to generate this content. In a few episodes, he literally goes the extra mile and travels to provide a personal touch to the conversation. GEEX believes the glass community is incredibly lucky to have this resource, and it's our goal to replace that luck with financial support. We have an initial goal of raising $2,800 to support this 4-episode series. That translates down to 100 listeners chipping in $7 each per episode. We hope that you'll support Percy's expertise and help us establish precedent by compensating valued voices in the field. Every donation really counts. We have a link in the show notes to get started. If you're on a computer, click the donation button on our Taming Lightning page. If you're listening on the go, send a Venmo donation to @GeeksGlass with the word plasma. That's PLASMA. Thanks in advance for your support.
Welcome back, or welcome to the Taming Lightning podcast. I'm Percy Echols II. I'm the creator and host of Taming Lightning, as well as the emerging plasma tech at Pittsburgh Glass Center. Taming Lightning podcast features a series of conversations to help expand our understanding of plasma and neon light, looking beyond its associations with novelty and sign making, and to explore the potential for noble gases as an artistic medium. Hello, Lightning Tamers. This is episode number 37. In today's podcast, I'll be joined by Ben Orozco for Chapter 4 of the Intro to Plasma series in collaboration with GEEX, the Glass Education Exchange.
This series is an introduction for glass educators and makers who are new to the process of plasma, as well as an introduction to Percy and his thoughts and experiences on learning about plasma.
In Chapter 4, Starting Your Plasma Journey, we'll be discussing a plethora of things, covering topics around technology and the elements of plasma diagram, such as the vacuum manifold and the gas transfer system, how I started my own plasma setup, and one of the most important tools, mindset.
So let's get right into it and start off by talking about your plasma journey. We covered the process of collaborating and you making work for your 2015 BFA exhibition in Chapter 1, 2, and 3. But what happened since then, Percy?
Well, I graduated and I spent a year as a grad at large, where I worked at the university making glass work for a short time, trying to keep my hands in the glass. So a grad at large would not be sustainable. Like if you stay too long, you kind of get in the way of students who pay to learn. Now I am still paying for that access, but they're there entirely in that process, and it just isn't quite sustainable in that end. So the only thing I could do, or you could do, was to go somewhere or work with someone where you could have access to glass. Now, of course, you could build your own studio, but were you really prepared for such a financial endeavor after graduation? For me, not at all. So I ended up putting out applications at the Chrysler Museum Glass Studio in Norfolk, Virginia. You have the Pittsburgh Glass Center in Pittsburgh, PA, and the Corning Museum of Glass internship in Corning, New York.
And would you say this is a model that a lot of post BFA or BA grads would take?
You know, Ben, I don't know. Honestly, I haven't had this discussion with a lot of glass artists with an academic background. You know, speaking broadly, seeking opportunities like apprenticeships and internships or work is common, if not universal. So how else are you going to continue working in glass? Sometimes it's easier to get into an apprenticeship or internship in this case. In that case, I ended up choosing the Pittsburgh Glass Center, which turned out to be the most valuable choice for me. And there are some benefits with this. Of the three I listed were the three that I had to choose from. So between the Pittsburgh Glass Center, the Chrysler Museum, and Corning. And some of the benefits that came with going to the Pittsburgh Glass Center has been having housing in a nearby neighborhood with a supported community. Like neighbors you can actually ask questions about of nearby grocery stores or whatever as you start to get used to the city. You get a stipend for your groceries and your material costs. Free studio time is always a big thing. It's pretty much common amongst those three choices in many different facilities like that. And then the one tuition-free summer class, which is a great spot for networking with the glass and Pittsburgh art community. And I took with me some of my tools, my color, and I bought a bike, which was fine because Pittsburgh is very easy to navigate on bike. And then I began my 1-year technician apprenticeship starting in May 2016. So here I learned about what it took to build and maintain in a glass studio, which is essential. Hands-on experience is very important, which may not be available in glass education for those in public or academic glass learners. It's a different sort of approach to having the skill sets to work the material and then understanding how to maintain and develop the equipment that you use to work with. And this could be things like how to program a kiln or annealer, recognizing warning signs in equipment and the needs for repair, or even how to charge or fill a furnace. And many of these duties are handled by a technician in a public studio, or they're handled by, say, a graduate in the MFA program at your university. And then, as part of this technician job, or this technician apprenticeship, you are part of what makes this run smoothly, safely, and you are there to help keep things fun. So being able to interact with and serve the needs of your patrons, renters, staff, and instructors becomes very important. So moving forward, it was July 2016 that the Pittsburgh Glass Center received a donation of neon equipment. Actually, 2 donations of neon equipment.
And did you have any idea that this was going to happen in May 2016 when you started your apprenticeship?
No, this was kind of unexpected. While one may use the word random, donations like these are accepted by decision, so one can induce that there's an interest in neon at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. And, by this time I had been like a year since I had previously worked in plasma, keyword with here, because there was the exhibition and then there was that gap where I didn't have a lot of access to people who did that or just couldn't get the workout that I was interested in. And there's different reasons for that. But in the meantime, I had received guidance from Patrick Collentine to learn about all the parts of the neon equipment.
And this was around the time that you started the Taming Lightning podcast, right?
Yes, I was thinking about the idea of a podcast while starting this process. I was listening to a lot of podcasts in my free time and got inspired to start my own. Finding Mastery has been kind of a prototype for that. Like that podcast itself, where the host is talking to a lot of high performers and sharing their habits through, sports psychology. And it's not such a big leap from just asking for help. In this way, when you can't understand something, the only thing you can do is really talk to someone who does. And because they're pretty connected, I thought if I was learning it, maybe some other people want to learn from those same people.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like reaching out to those first podcast guests? Was it hard to ask for that help and get a little guidance?
No, I won't say it was easy, but it wasn't unfamiliar to me. You see, I grew up with the internet and lived with, message boards of, my favorite webcomic fandoms, in which, many of my decisions to pursue art came from the encouragement of, strangers. Some whom I've reconnected with as of recently as our paths kind of matured on our endeavors. But it did help that I had somewhere to start, and that was Patrick Collentine for real. So like having that person and then having Ash Williamson kind of led me down the path of being able to talk to a lot of different people, and often that's by referral in the community.
Yeah, I would say it definitely helps to have some sort of mentor or someone to connect you with other figures in the field to get started. So you were working with Pat Collentine to understand all this equipment, but then what did you do next to start the plasma setup at PGC, at the Pittsburgh Glass Center?
I ended up writing up a proposal for the Pittsburgh Glass Center to use the neon equipment to build a plasma setup, and this was submitted sometime in September in 2016. So this is like materials, diagrams, places where it could exist inside the studio, class examples and structures, and then kind of having an actual 3D model cutout design for like materials for how the gas manifold was to look like, in addition to like adjusting it by having it on a cart for mobility's sake. So I had an idea where to go from here, but like ultimately I needed the time to learn, and then the best way for me to learn was just by doing. Sometimes just have my hands on it and kind of comparing what I've been able to read and hear allowed me to continue working on that process. But by the end of 2016, I had completed the initial plasma setup and was filling my first piece on New Year's Eve.
That must have felt so empowering. We'll talk a little bit more about what you've done since then after a short break.
Hi, I'm Emily, the Assistant Director of Glass Education Exchange, aka GEEX. Are you learning or teaching glass in the middle of a pandemic? That's right, I'm talking about COVID-19. GEEX is here to support the present and ongoing needs of educators and co-learners through virtual programming and resources, including our GEEX Talks lecture series, our calendar of public glass-related events, community spotlights, and other programming like our monthly book club and weekly movement class. All of our programs are free, donation-based, or low cost to increase accessibility. You can check us out on the web at geeks.glass and on all social platforms as Geeks Glass. That's one word.
So Percy, tell us what you've done since that first plasma fill.
Well, when I look back at it, I've done quite a lot. I'm so driven to keep going forward and towards this forming idea that sometimes a sense of progress or even achievement doesn't seem to, register. So I'll kind of do like a selective timeline starting after my apprenticeship in 2017. So after the apprenticeship, I was selected for a residency at the Brewhouse Association for Distillery 7. This was during a time where I had to start living on my own and beginning to support myself financially, a day job. The residency helped me make the decision to keep going and keep working on my art and projects by connecting to a community of artists through like a shared studio space. One of the things I kind of missed from my academia is being able to be kind of working in my own space and be surrounded by people doing different things. sometimes that can be a little difficult when you're kind of in and out in like a clear timestamp, and you don't have time to talk to a lot of people in the studio. So it's nice to have a kind of a home base for that. Later that year, I was invited by Patrick Collentine to participate in the Vitro Illuminato exhibition at the Brango studio during the 2018 Glass Art Society conference in Murano. Now, in order to fund the travel, I took on additional work besides my fish market job, and I instructed as a TA for classes and events that happened at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. And I pretty much split my time to assist artist designer Jen Figg and Matt McCormick. And at the same time, the Glass Art Society conference in 2018 was where I met Mundy Hepburn, Wayne Stratman, and Ed Kirshner. Now, later on in that summer of 2018, I invited and assisted Wayne Stratman and Mundy Hepburn to teach a Pittsburgh Glass Center's first plasma workshop using in-house equipment, which successfully tested the mobile plasma lab in an intense work environment. Additionally, I became the first recipient of the Ron Desmond Memorial Award for Imagination with Glass from the Pittsburgh Glass Center in 2018. The award recognized artists who think outside the box, practice curiosity, and take risks to create unique, imaginative works in glass and incorporating glass, characteristics that the PGC's late co-founder Ron Desmond valued. I continue perfecting a mobile plasma lab at the Pittsburgh Glass Center to conduct demonstrations for the public and bring plasma capabilities into the center through the Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh grant and residency awarded in 2019. Now, through this grant, I've been able to travel to Boston to visit the personal studios of Wayne Stratman, and by neighboring studio in Connecticut at Mundy Hepburn during the Photons in Focus Plasma Art Alliance meetup, in which I was invited as a committee member. I also visited studios in the Bay Area for Neon and Plasma, including Ed Kirshner, Nerd Glass, Cork Markeski, and Bruce Suba, as well as travels to Sweden, in which I met and traveled with Tommy Gustafsson, the last neon bender in all of Scandinavia, and taught a workshop with Ed Kirshner and Jaime Guerrero at the Glass Factory in Boda Glassbrook, refining on the ways that we taught the Blow and Glow class at Pittsburgh Glass Center that summer. But due to the pandemic, plans for 2020s, and especially the gas conference in Sweden, were deconstructed. And I was invited to present virtually about plasma, taking the opportunity to get the word out about my podcast and the Plasma Art Alliance and the process. This also pushed back plans for the conclusion of my residency, in which I had recently curated the Pittsburgh Glass Center's first neon and plasma exhibition called Lit, Light and Transmission, featuring the works of 14 artists as a survey of the diverse range of light art within the shared media of both neon and plasma sculpture, which we're still kind of rolling on right now. We're opening up a couple of new opportunities and creating new content in which we can start bringing the public in on what is neon and what is plasma.
So it really sounds like you took those opportunities where you could find them. And, plasma is really such a small field. And you actively continued to participate in the community once you got your feet in the process of plasma. I have to say, way to start building those spaces for other plasma artists and neon artists as well with your exhibition. Sort of taking all of these both opportunities and then limitations. After a quick break from our sponsor, we'll discuss starting from scratch in plasma.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Information Unlimited, founded in 1974 by Bob Iannini, whose work helped pave the way to make high voltage accessible to everyone. Information Unlimited is a pioneer in DIY electronics for hobbyists and hackers, experimenters, and researchers, holding many patents that have contributed to the electronics and specifically the high voltage fields, which includes the plasma drivers, power supplies, and miscellaneous tools used by myself and many learning and practicing plasma light artists and enthusiasts. Now, when I began my plasma journey, I was introduced to the entry-level plasma driver Neon 21, and later the PVM12 and PVM400 models. If you get an opportunity to take the plasma workshops or classes that are available, you will find these listed among the few commercially available plasma drivers. Now, to purchase these plasma drivers or transformers, go to amazing1.com. That's amazing, the number 1.com. Hover over the tab Neon and Plasma and select Transformers, Single End, and Special Effects. Now, there's a lot to see in this website, and we'll be sure to provide you with links in our show notes. If you have any questions about their products, you can give them a call at 603-673-4730.
So, Percy, in your story at the Pittsburgh Glass Center, you brought up some important considerations to start from scratch in plasma. One of the biggest ones was facilities.
Yeah, it's pretty important to have a facility to be able to do this. For me, having a studio where plasma facility can exist is very important. One thing it does is it allows you to have public access to, which leads you to having more collaborative opportunities where people are working together on a singular project where they have different skills to make that happen. Which is one person could have a specific skill set in glass working, another person being the person to fill it up and have varying effects happen, or even have knowledge to augment or complete that project, which has been able to make, again, collaborations much easier to happen. By having a gas filling manifold design on a cart, it became mobile, allowing me to move it around the facilities such as the Pittsburgh Glass Center and use it in different available studio spaces, where I can have it in the flame studio on the first floor, or on the second floor in the hot shop, or in the kiln studio. And if I'm doing something where I don't have things prepped correctly, like we talked about in the last chapter, I can also do that in the cold shop if it's nice and clear and clean. So one of the important features of really having this mobile cart is, having an independent gas setup for the torch, which allows me even more flexibility. And that allows me to work in spaces that don't have propane, natural gas, compressed air, or oxygen hookups. And, I've been working with the Pittsburgh Glass Center on ideas for future expansions and constructions as well. Some of the questions that I get asked about plasma and neon were specifically the need for space in regards to that expansion. Like I mentioned, the current plasma lab is a mobile setup which was designed to move from studio to studio within the Glass Center. And the problem that can occur is the reduced access to kilns as studio activity increases. Something will have to be, which is something that has to be addressed. So ideally, we would need to be able to create a space for processing. As a public access space, it's best practice to leave the primary usage of the equipment for filling and bombarding, if you're doing neon, up to the trained staff, which further protects, gives protection to the public. And this is something that I observed in other places as well, whether it's Urban Glass or Western Neon School of Art. Any place that has neon, the students and the public are not they're not working on the equipment. They get to see the process if it's prepared correctly, but having its own location kind of allows for more freedom for people to make and then be also observing that process. There's additional considerations like workspace, to which plasma is largely unaffected due to having various processes available for vessel crafting, whether it's furnace glass blowing, flame working, or kiln working. So space for bending and teaching would then be shared with the flame studio in regards to this construction for expansion at the Pittsburgh Glass Center.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of really good points to think about in regards to access and where you can actually work in the space.
Yeah.
So the next one is talking about equipment. We've covered a lot of the processes of vessel crafting, filling, and illumination in chapter 2 and 3, and the different kinds of equipment that you can get, including equipment that you must have in the moment to get started in the process, and then longer term equipment if you want to start making plasma independently.
So first we're going to start with the must-haves. These are things that you'll need to get started. which we have mentioned in Chapter 2 and 3. So, for example, these would be electrodes, which will help you transfer electricity into the piece. You have your transformer, which provides the power to light up those pieces, and a torch to weld on or tip off your glasswork. So things such as having an air pump with map gas tank or an oxypropane hand torch, where most studios will have some sort of hand torch, whether it's in the flame studio or in the hot shop. It's all about dialing that in for the specific size of the work that you're working on. If you're doing something that's like a tube, you don't want a big old fluffy torch. You want something that can dial in a finer flame.
Right. And refer to Chapter 3 for more guides on working with those torches.
And then when we're talking about long-term equipment, the long-term equipment will allow you to fill your pieces. Although, if we think about it, there's kind of a midpoint or a midpoint for that in exploring plasma, which will be helpful when you happen to get a little deeper in the process. And this is kind of about your budget, right? So this could be such as working with another collaborator to fill your for the filling process, where having equipment for doing your own leak checking will save you in the long run by investing in, say, a small vacuum pump and a spark coil for leak detection. And this will cost you about maybe $150 tops, but it's totally worth it if you don't plan on building your own gas filling manifold, which can cost you thousands.
Mm-hmm. And if you do decide to stop here and making your own plasma setup, keep listening. Having knowledge on the equipment and filling process we'll get into can help you further understand and explore your vessel forms, construction, and just being a better plasma maker overall.
And then continuing on our thing for long-term equipment.
And this is mostly situated around the gas filling manifold, right, Percy?
Yes, this is entirely around the process in which you have access to glass or someone making glass, and you are making a gas filling manifold.
And so for components, we discussed the different parts of the gas filling manifold during the filling stage of Chapter 3. It's lit Chemistry of Collaboration. But let's give a little bit more information on these parts.
Sure. So as we go through these components, we'll kind of give you a bit more information from which we had kind of talked about in the last chapter. So first up, we're talking about vacuum pumps, which is a roughing vacuum pump for our uses. It's a scientific quality pump used to remove atmosphere from a plasma vessel and manifold at a rough vacuum range, which is something that we measure in microns or millitorr, a range between atmospheric, which is the pressure we experience right now, and about 10 to the negative 3 or 3 thousandths of a torr or 3 microns, and this is typically seen situated at the bottom of your plasma setup. Examples of roughing pumps used are mechanical pumps, and you can read more on those on the Basic Vacuum Practice PDF under the chapter title Roughing Pumps. Next, we have our gas tanks or flasks. Plasma practitioners will often use tanks for larger volumes and quantities, and these are high purity gases. As you mentioned, those are your neon, argon, krypton, xenon, helium, nitrogen, and maybe some other type of gases as well, and vapors. So neon practitioners can get away with having smaller tanks or flasks of gases due to the difference in use. Now, you will often find setup between the two may differ, but I'll be sticking to talking about tanks, which will commonly be fitted with a CGA 580 fitting. These are common for tanks supplying nitrogen and noble gases. And one of our sponsors, Global Rare Gases, would be an example of a gas distributor. Next up, we have our pressure lines. They act as a reservoir between your gas tank and your needle valve. It must be rated to withstand the pressure rating of the gas tank. Due to my training with Swagelok, where I had access to a lot of different, information and booklets and some procedures to work in this process of bending tubing and making the right fit for my stuff. Your decisions for your diameter will be dependent on whether you choose copper or stainless steel tubing. Either works because we are using high purity gases, so there's no worry about corrosion or corruption or oxidation in this case. And then With that, the smaller diameter and thicker walls tend to be much stronger and easier to bend, but require a little bit more length for volume because you're working with a smaller diameter that's less space compared to have a larger diameter. And then we have our needle valves for our gases, which you can purchase with Viton O-ring seals for vacuum work, which allows for small controlled additions of gas. And you can find both needle valves and O-rings from a lot of different companies. And then you have gauges, which allow you to read the pressure and vacuum. There are varying types of specific ranges and accuracies. And of those two gauges, we have the fill gauge and the vacuum gauge. So the fill gauge, for example, DVR2 from Vacuum Brand, is an example of a capacitance manometer. And you can read more about this in the basic vacuum practice for these gauges, but typically these type of gauges or of this sort are used as fill gauges, which allow you to read the pressure inside of your vessel and manifold for adding gases. And then you have your vacuum gauge, such as the VAP5, which is an example of a thermocouple gauge. Again, you can refer to the basic vacuum practice under the chapter for gauges. And this is used to measure vacuum in your vessel and manifold to determine its cleanliness or emptiness within the vessel. There are various types of gauges that can read from rough vacuum, which is a range of 0.003 of a torr to 3 microns or millitorr, and greater for high or ultra-high vacuum. These are just two examples, and there are different types of gauges that you can use. It's important to make sure you're using the right gauges for the processes that you're working with. For example, neon will end up using a fill gauge. It doesn't have to go as high as atmosphere. So that would not be real useful for those of us who are doing plasma. But vice versa, it wouldn't matter too much for our neon benders. It just gives them a little extra if they want to, say, perhaps pursue plasma. So again, best fit tools for the best fit use. And then we have our manifold. Part of our manifold is called the body of the manifold, which is the mediator between the gas transfer system, such as your gas tanks, your pressure lines, and your valves, to your tubulation that will connect to your piece. This could be glass or metal or a mixture of the two. You often have some ratio of that in your system anyways, such as your gauges or your part of your needle valves and things of that sort. When you're thinking about the body of your manifold, glass is easier to make for those who are familiar with glass. Easier to clean and detect leaks, and also easier to repair. But it is fragile. Metal, which has more chances of flashback, which is the process in which energy travels back from your ignition point on your transformer into the pieces and could damage your gauges and such. It is more reactive to certain substances and hard to determine if there is a system link and more difficult and more expensive to repair. But it is, again, much harder to damage and pretty stable and strong. Now, personally, I think if I were to redo this system for the Pittsburgh Glass Center and make it from scratch, I think I would have put more metal into the system. That is, making the system from the valves, which already has metal going back into the tanks, and leading my manifold, that my gas transfer system, where I have my gauges, my valves leading into the main body. I think I would put a little more metal in there just for a little bit more strength there, because that's the part I've been having a lot of struggles with recently, where I'm trying to make this part that fits between these two separate systems, the main body and the gas transfer system, to accommodate all these different gases. And there's quite a few more that we'll go through here. They're not as lengthy at this point, but you have the stopcocks, and that's part of the manifold here, where it's another type of valve that blocks off certain pathways, such as to your vacuum pump, or to isolate from your gauges, or to air so you can attach your blowhose, or to close from the outside air when the manifold is not in use, to keep the inside area nice and clean. You also have the addition of a grounding electrode, which allows you to ground any potential flashbacks from damaging gauges or valves in a glass manifold. Or if you're having a metal manifold, you're grounding your entire metal manifold. And then lastly, the blow-off valve, which we say it's optional. I think, Ben, you would agree that this is something that is important to put on your system or to even consider. because this allows you to release pressure if it reaches a certain level. So, such as like overpressurizing your glass manifold, which could break it, or even overpressurizing can damage your gauges even. So some variations would be like a poor man's blow-off valve, which is adding a little cap on the end of a piece of glass tubing that can blow off, or having something professional such as a part, whether it's glass or metal, that responds to a certain amount of pressure, say like 15 psi or 5 psi, whatever it is. You can set it to. You can adjust those things, and I'll include links in the show notes for resources around manifold building and building your plasma setup in addition to all this. Now, if you'd like me to cover any of these processes in further detail, just let me know, especially in the YouTube comments. We'll continue this discussion on manifold building and long-term plasma setups after a quick word from our sponsor. Today's podcast is sponsored by Global Rare Gases by Jim Avold, who trades in crude and purified rare gases, and as a small company is agile in tending to the needs of their customers, including small business and personal consumers of rare gases. Now, Global Rare Gases has been a favorite supplier for Taming Lightning and the Pittsburgh Glass Center. They provide honest and informed purchasing, speedy, efficient, and reliable delivery. I've personally recommended Global Rare Gases to neon vendors and emerging plasma enthusiasts throughout the United States, as well as internationally. We'll provide in the show notes a listing of prices as of this episode release. But if you want to know more or looking for other tank sizes, please contact Global Rare Gases at 419-661-1465 or by email at jimavolt@globalraregases.com.
And we're back. So Percy, how would you describe the assembly process of building a manifold? What are some of the general things to keep in mind?
Ben, of all the processes we are using with assembling the manifolds, they're often described as like clamping or screwing components together. They do have their own specific terms, but each component will have their specific connection types, and some being a little bit more effective for vacuum compared to some who are specialized for pressurized lines. And this would be a difference between like having your setup which works with your gas transfer system, which connects your tanks to your pressurized lines to your valves, versus what happens on the manifold side where you have your other components hooking up to your vacuum pumps or hooking up to your vessel. And if you're interested in building your own manifold and you want to have a better idea of what these different connection types are, you may have to work with someone who's constructed manifolds to help you with your particular needs. And some of these could be the companies that we will talk about, such as like Swagelok or some other scientific glass worker that will be very familiar with this process. So in addition to that, it may be important to also have a clean working space, because we are kind of working with a lot of complex components that you don't want to get dirty or damaged.
Mm-hmm. And are there any situations / troubleshooting encounters that you repeatedly find yourself in as you started your own plasma setup? Are there any suggestions or processes you might have for someone thinking about starting their own long-term setup?
I'm constantly relearning things, and in this process, you'll be facing bouts of frustration, be confused, and may even have a hard time understanding things. So one of the best things you can do is reach out and ask questions. Ask the same question to different people. Research related content in videos and papers, and search or start discussions in online communities. I think online communities is a very important part that we should not underestimate, even if you're kind of tired of being online right now during COVID. Additionally, being organized and having all your components available at assembly. Because I learn best through visual and kinesthetic learning, that is, being able to see and touch things, this helps me keep things proportionate when I'm designing or planning. You may also want to make sure that you're choosing the right component and services versus skimping out. For example, there was a point where I should have purchased a stainless steel fitted components versus brass because I needed something that was a little more durable, since the assembly would mean I would be disassembling quite frequently until I had settled on my design and fabrication for the remodeling of the plasma filling manifold cart. Being willing to pay for the parts and to be fabricated and have specialized components. While I'm very familiar with glass and confident with my welds, I didn't have the accuracy and precision needed, and that held me back when I was making some of the parts for connecting my manifold. So I had to let someone who fabricate those parts that I needed, because they had exactly the skills needed to meet the blueprints I created for that. Given that I had the design laid out, this could have been my step 2 instead of my step 6 spanning over weeks of time. None of that was really wasted, because when I finally acknowledged my own limits and weighed that against my progress, it provided me with ample failures to redesign both the glass and metal parts. So for me, I took that experience as a way to provide the best blueprint so that the person fabricating it knew exactly what I wanted and I knew exactly what I needed. So that's like an important lesson you could take from that. And then also leaks will happen. They're officially unavoidable. You can do as many precautions as possible. They're just things that can pop up from how you reassemble. If it's off a little bit, if you left a bit of hair in your connection, if you didn't put on gloves, those could be detriments to your whole setup. And that can be a headache to clean every joint and make sure everything's fitted correctly after kind of rushing or not taking the proper precautions. So my advice on leaks is to keep your system clean. If you can, avoid materials that may contaminate your system until you are confident or comfortable with making that step and limiting that setup. Making adjustments do add the potential of leaks, as I mentioned, as you're reassembling and connecting things together. And, a system can really stay clean for quite some time. So save your cleaning for things like contamination via phosphors or powders or uses of dopants for specific times in the year, kind of like how everyone does a year, twice a year studio cleanup sort of deal. Put that on your list there, especially if you don't need to make the upgrade now. Don't worry about it.
And while we're talking about manifolds and working with equipment, I also wanted to touch base and ask why we aren't listing exact component names for plasma equipment.
Well, this is mainly due to how often these businesses change and shift, whether they be in operation or inventory. And there's a lot of different products you can use for this. And we did use some few examples earlier on, and we do kind of try to provide some here or there, but because the systems and the things that you're using are entirely up to you and what's available to you and what's closest to you, there's just so many things to consider. Now, if you want, I can do my best to answer some of those questions in additional blogs or updating related posts. But what's going to really help us is if you leave a comment of things that you like me to list related to products and suppliers. That way I can really tailor that in instead of just kind of listing everything like throwing, spaghetti on the floor.
And it's a good thing to remember that plasma is such a small field. Using equipment that could be decades old from a dismantled neon shop or wherever else people can get a hold of vacuum technology, their torches, or other components. So being a member of the community and interviewing all these artists, makers, scientists with the Taming Lightning podcast, would you say there's a bit of variation in each person's plasma setup?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of different ways people will handle their setup depending on their studio, their budget, and what materials they happen to find, and the kind of work they make. And with all that being said, what I do and what I prepared is a combination of other people's considerations that I found would work for me. And that's kind of like the same story there.
Mm-hmm. So after covering some of the tangible things we need to build a plasma setup, let's talk about some of the ways you managed to push through working in this challenging process after a short break.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Swagelok, Pittsburgh, tri-state area. Swagelok Pittsburgh is a local and trusted supplier of premium quality, industry-leading Swagelok componentry and value-added strategic services, including application solutions, safety training, fluid system evaluations, expert design and assembly support, and inventory management. Now, I personally recommend Swagelok for its services and expertise from my experience at the Pittsburgh location in regard to trainings and purchases for the Pittsburgh Glass Center. It has been my go-to supplier for reliable, efficient, and well-informed products. Now, this has been especially helpful in the current remodeling of the Plasma Manifold cart, which I'm finishing up here shortly. For the Pittsburgh location, call 412-761-3212 or check out the website at pittsburgh.swagelok.com. Now, since Swagelok is accessible with locations and distributors worldwide, to find your local Swagelok, go to www.swagelok.com.
Knowing how layered and technical all these plasma processes we've covered in chapter 1, 2, and 3 are, I wanted to touch base about mindset and just ask you what traits or habits have helped you push through as a self-starter to continue making in plasma.
So I'm going to start with some definitions. Defined by the Oxford Dictionary, a self-starter is a person who is sufficiently motivated or ambitious to start a new career or business or to pursue further education without the help of others. By that definition, I'm not a self-starter because my motivation doesn't exclude me from needing or wanting help, support, or encouragement. Those I connected with, the community, and the institutions have been instrumental in my growth. The more you accept help, the more that can be achieved. So if you change over to another definition from, say, dictionary.com, it's a person who begins work or undertakes a project on his or own initiative without needing to be told or encouraged to do so. And I think that's more accurate. Plasma is full of challenges. To pull from my entry into plasma and starting from scratch, it was asking for guidance and help from Patrick Collentine and Ash Williamson. This pursuit is filled with failures, breakages, compromise, confusion, doubt, and reconsideration. There will be times when the only voice you have will be your own, a breath expelling your most inner voice that interacts with your reality, and an inhalation of that reality that you take into yourself. So you must be able to train that voice in pursuit of a reality that empowers you and those around you to be curious, passionate, and move with a purpose. So some of these traits might include perhaps empathy, being able to understand the point of view of your collaborators, people sharing the studio space, and people you want to learn from. A sense of care or compassion, to be mindful and have genuine concern about those around you. Expectation, to manage your expectations. I have a quote from Basic Vacuum Practice which reads as such: varying degrees of emptiness are required for various types of work. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes because it has both the contextual and philosophical meaning behind it. In context, it means that there are various things that can be achieved by various levels of vacuum, such as the difference between the type of vacuum you need to deflate your air mattress versus what is done for neon versus what is done for space or plasma research, or the emptiness that is achieved by being open to new ideas in order to receive new information, or sharing a part of yourself, that emptiness, the emptying of yourself by sharing information with other people, or sharing love or sharing concern. You have things that I've kind of touched up on in the chapter 1 notes, which is curiosity, passion, and purpose. Curiosity, to explore and learn from various people and sources. Passion, to continue when you fail and when understanding is beyond your grasp. And purpose, the reason why, or something that you find meaningful for you. For me, the process of alchemy, the process of exploring and learning about plasma, has given me a sense of purpose. By understanding, you can appreciate the creation of something, to find overlap in that connection between things.
I would completely agree that these traits are very essential when working in any neon or plasma practice where the margin of error can be so thin. I think purpose is a really good note to bring up your podcast. And I wanted to ask you what inspired you to start the Taming Lightning podcast and also decide to share your knowledge with the world?
I've always listened to podcasts, and I wanted to do a podcast. And so, when I started with my mentor, Patrick Collentine, he had, explained that he had some experience broadcasting. Now, later on, I learned that his mentor, Cork Markeski, he had also done a lot of different things, such as directing, broadcasting, radio, and all that stuff. So there's kind of that shared timeline there, shared lineage of sorts, I suppose. Um, and it seems like, when it came to plasma, there was no consolidated information. So for me, I need to talk to people who did neon and also plasma, because they are connected in their process. If you're going to say anything, plasma is the umbrella in which neon has refined itself. Plasma is a bit of a fringe process, which, unlike the commercial excellence of neon, hasn't received the same attention and research for illumination. That keyword illumination here. Plasma has received a lot of research in terms of how it works in the universe, how it can be used in terms of propulsion and other types of sciences and energy sources and things like that, but not in the way that we are using it as a display or artwork or a type of illumination. And this regards things like bake-out procedures and gas filling theory or guidelines will vary from person to person in our field artistically. And production wise. And, I'm not afraid of people taking what I've shared and making it better. If I can make that much easier for someone to connect to their glass blowing skill and to create a vacuum sealable vessel, I'm happy. And if they take it to levels that I can never dream or create, dude, that's just amazing. So I don't feel I own any part of that process that I share. Even if it's like a scrappy idea, because just because I created some kind of study doesn't mean that I entirely own it, but that can be just my preference. And I'm not saying that everyone has to agree with that. Personally, it's something that you have to find within yourself and find the right boundaries for that. And, I've learned from people doing this process well, and I've seen some questionable practices and some unfortunate outcomes. So whatever I can help share to keep people safe and responsible is high on my list. Unfortunately, that can often mean the information is incomplete or even delayed until I can really present that information as complete as possible and as accurately as possible.
And when I first started Neon and I heard about your podcast, I had listened to it for a while before we even started this collaboration, or we met at the Glass Factory in Boda in 2019. I wanted to ask, at the start of every Taming Lightning episode, you mentioned looking beyond our associations with novelty and sign making and exploring the potential of noble gases as an artistic medium. So I wanted to ask you, Percy, where does the plasma field go from here?
I can't tell you where the field is going, but I can look at plasma but other than to look at plasma and be curious about the process. And I guess it just kind of sunk in a little bit here, but in my position as a committee member of the Plasma Art Alliance and my accessibility as a podcaster, it does put me in a position of leadership in a way. I need to be a point of reference for pointing people in the right direction. So there's definitely, and when I take that into consideration, there's definitely room for improvement. Further research and attention to the needs for guidelines and understanding of an illumination, and a way for it to hold up in today's commercial world, similar to the illusory distinction between craft and fine art, such as the commercialization of neon led to the demand for standardization in the process for quality, longevity, and safety. And I think recently I kind of came up with, for example, I know we don't try to throw out any products and whatnot, but Tech 22 is a neon company that produces a lot of great transformers. And the reason why they're able to get these transformers at such a small scale with the right amount of power has to do with a certain level of funding, which I'm hoping to do a little more research into how that came about. But one lead says it was through some projects with Disney. They had a whole bunch of neon for like the Imagineer project somewhere, and they like threw money into developing a transformer that typically be like this big into something like this big, and that's kind of a thing that exists in this world, right? And additionally, we should also consider or reconsider the existing plasma workshop model. Something I've been working on and bringing up and discussing with Amy Lemire, but also amongst the Plasma Art Alliance committee, is that one of the things that has become very apparent through the process of learning and participating and teaching and like doing the podcast about plasma is like the need to look at how information is being presented and look at how the information is being learned. So when you look at a plasma workshop environment, the workshop for the most part when it comes to art is to be able to practice the art medium or practice within the context of art for which the particular skill, technique, or process as an artist, brings as an instructor. So when you look at plasma, there's a lot to understand, and students are hungry for information. So for an instructor, the task of relaying all the information regarding the plasma from scratch is overwhelming and even considered impossible to convey that information and knowledge in such a short time. So just comparing this process to all the other methods of manipulating glass, you can see that when a glass student comes into a glass studio and they are taking a class related to glass, the facility knows the medium well. There are books, there are articles, there are YouTube videos about the glass blowing, kiln, flame working, coal working process. Everything is familiar. Go into a plasma class and the instructor will know, but sometimes the TA will be familiar, and less often the students, and least likely the facility will know enough about plasma. And what people are used to is being able to jump into that process, right? And having the ability to draw the information in that scope in the session, whether it's 3 days, a week, multiple weeks of programming, which it still isn't enough for something like plasma. As we've gone through together here, there's a lot that comes into this process. So for me, I want to be able to bring or see a bridge of knowledge that people can work through. And I think with the Intro to Plasma series, we are getting somewhere in which this could be a preliminary resource for Plasma Workshop students. This way the instructors can fill in the gaps and students can be more readily integrate the structural standards for which they can express their artistic practice and build up skills to which they can expand on. This is no small endeavor. It takes a lot to understand, and it takes more to share and teach.
Definitely. I happened to take a plasma workshop with Wade Stratman and Cedric Guinar at 2018 at the Pilchuck Glass School, and I was so curious for the students who didn't happen to have a lot of previous neon or plasma experience. What happens afterwards if they want to keep growing that practice?
I feel like many workshop attendees don't really know where to go after completing their classes, especially in fields whether it's neon or plasma, because of the limited facilities and learning opportunities that may be available to them resourceful-wise, right, as a resource. So even if there is some knowledge or suggestion, the next steps are kind of unclear or vague in some regards. Welcome to being alive. Hopefully this series can kind of give you a map of where you can plot your own knowledge for your journey. But, in the end, it does rely on this aspect of community. And when we say community, some people think it's pretty abstract. It's not ambiguous. A community is a place where there are people that you care about, support, and want to work with and share information with. So again, we'll kind of throw that back into chapter 3 where we listed a few communities, both the Neon and Plasma for Beginners group, which combines both communities together, where people can learn one or the other or both. So that's a good point to stick into.
And speaking of community, I wanted to ask, how do you think we can increase accessibility and more innovation to people like yourself in this field?
Well, on top of being financially supported in some fashion, which, again, it's about being able to find a way to make the work, but also make money from the work to sustain making more stuff, which is, everyone's problem, right? It's the need to spread the sense of curiosity and passion and purpose as foundations. For me, it works. It works really well for me to be able to use that as drivers. It may not work for other people, but finding something that's going to keep you burning through that and then connecting with the community, right? So that type of community support helps. And having a mindset to drive forward is definitely helpful, because people want to see that. People want to see someone who's kind of really into it. They don't want to see someone who's kind of walking on the edges, and that's something that I kind of personally are starting to understand. And I feel you have to feel like you could work with like-minded or different-minded and different voices or non-dominant voices of people. Being able to be in an opposing or tangential or adjacent fields and discussions actually helps push things forward. So for me, working with Ralph Crew on Isn't That Something as part of our project to further expand a different way to approach and express plasma is really cool, because he comes from a scientific background and I come from an artistic based background, and we overlap, and then I learn from him and we connect, and it's exciting, right? But then again, without financial and community support, I think personally, I don't think I would have definitely given up a lot sooner on this whole process. If there wasn't some kind of support, I think there would have been a point where I would have gave up. I think if I didn't have some of these other foundations floating around for me, I think it'd be done. Taming Lightning would have disappeared, I guess, perhaps. Or maybe not even started. Who knows? It's another timeline.
And I really hope that in the coming years, GEEX will have built a supportive space for more people to work in plasma, neon, glass, and beyond. We normally end every chapter of the Intro to Plasma series with some exercises to take away and start engaging in the topics we discuss. Today, we have a pretty simple question for you to think about.
Yeah, so some of the questions here would be to ask yourself, what do you want to do? Do you want to make work, or do you want to facilitate the process of making plasma? Look at the resources that you have available for glassmaking. Do you have access to skills, facilities, or a community? And continue to ask yourself, why do you want to use plasma in your work? And maybe by learning why, you can push through the challenges that come your way in pursuing it, as plasma can be quite a frustrating medium. And these questions can help inform you on how to get started. Build a map to how you want to approach this, because everyone's path is going to be pretty individualistic. In this case, feel free to join some of the communities listed in the show notes for Chapter 3. And reach out to me and let's talk. This way I can definitely help point you in the right direction for what you like to pursue.
So Percy, it's been great to work with you and organize this 4-chapter series as a guide for beginners to get started. I'm really grateful that you've shared so much of your story and knowledge to help beginners get a sense of what the process not only looks like, but what it feels like to work as an alchemist in such an expansive and technical material.
Thanks, Ben. And I hope this encourages and empowers onlookers and people curious about the process to start looking in, doing research, and making a plan on how they want to get started in the art and also the alchemy of plasma. So please revisit the series and Taming Lightning and come back to it as you start your plasma journey, making plasma vessels, filling and illumination, collaboration, and starting your own plasma journey. Now, during this 4-part series, it was a collaboration with GEEX, and that was a lot of support and fundraising to, support this process and myself for presenting this information. So through this entire project, I was able to build a functional workstation, which allowed me to, set up my desk, set up my computer, which is very much needed. You guys have watched me through this whole part where there were some delays, or I tried to give a little insight on the behind the scenes where my computer was basically a big part of this process. And with that, malfunctioning, that meant that, there was a lot of setbacks, and that made it very frustrating to do this. And, working with Ben was awesome. I mean, he took on the role of doing a lot of the video work because my computer could not handle it at that time, and I didn't have the skill sets to do that. And through this format, you've done something pretty awesome. I think it's a good start to presenting a lot of different information, especially for something that's very visual that can't really be contained through audio alone. So, Ben helped me build these workable and actionable work habits and practices. I felt I improved a lot through this process as well, not just in being able to present information, but in my own practice as well. And this isn't an easy project, but I'm glad you're here with me, Ben, to work through all this.
Yeah, GEEX is really happy to support you, and I and GEEX are honored to have you as one of our first collaborators. It's definitely been a lot of learning for me too, getting to see the behind the scenes for what happens in a Taming Lightning episode, getting to plan and outline a script, and then really build this guide that is both topical but also actionable as well. So if you've been listening to the 4 chapters, our fundraiser for Taming Lightning, the GEEX and Taming Lightning fundraiser ends May 15th, 2021, which is about a month after our final release. Afterwards, you can support Percy directly by visiting his website, Taming Lightning, and we'll have links in the show notes on how to do so. Talk to you soon, Percy, on an upcoming podcast, maybe at a workshop or an exhibition one day. Who knows? Talk to you then.
All right. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Taming Lightning podcast. Music credits to the following artists in order of appearance. Retro by One, Serenity produced by Readyman, Boost by Joaquin Carude, Sunnyside by One, Mixtape produced by Readyman, Reentry by Lapse, Lucky produced by Obi, and The Process by Lakey Inspired. Please see the show notes for links to the artists. Thank you for listening to the final chapter of the Intro to Plasma series. Again, we have only scratched the surface on plasma illumination, from vessel crafting to alchemical fills, and the equipment and manifold considerations. I'm very happy with having this opportunity to provide a preliminary resource and starting point for discussion on plasma, for which we can start to ask questions to learn and develop better processes and create some unique illuminated works. While we have completed the series right now, there's much to come. Things to look forward to are blog posts of pulled points from the series that I can expand upon or package for easy access. I'd like to thank GEEX for inviting me to collaborate on this series, the director Helen Lee for starting the conversation, the assistant director Emily Leach, who works with Ben with the social medias and the video work, and the graphic designer and web manager Ben Orozco, whose co-hosting and content management skills have been outstanding and much appreciated. And if you don't know, he's handling all the video work in terms of putting this podcast on YouTube. Lastly, I'd like to thank Pittsburgh Glass Center for supporting me as a place of research and inspiration, as well as encouraging me to pursue this project. And the Plasma Art Alliance, where I have an access to a well of knowledge and connects me to some amazing and supportive people. If you'd like to support Taming Lightning, please donate to the Taming Lightning GEEX Intro to Plasma series, which ends May 15th, 2021. You can find all current episodes and information at geeks.glass, that's GEEX.glass, and should money be tight, please check out the Intro to Plasma series on YouTube and leave a comment about what you find useful and questions about what you'd like to hear from the current or future podcast, and I'll have links provided in the show notes for that as well. Please share, comment, and subscribe, and as always, be safe, be healthy, and be strong, and I'll see you next time.